Hi, everybody.
Hello, everybody. How are you all?
All righty, all righty, all righty. Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here. Grateful to have everyone together for Fireside yet again. We're going to do this Fireside on Module 2, which is explicitly titled The Global Financial System. But this week we're doing a complementary opposite take and exploring primarily the local financial system. Our guest, Rebecca, has been with us in since KB2, so I'll spare her too much about this current block, but want her to get a sense of who's around and it's been really cool getting to know so many of you in the weeks that have passed. It's, the third week explicitly of Kernel, but still week 2 because we have more time and people have shared an incredible diversity of projects, adventures, thoughts. The convos have been really, really compelling, and especially the one that we had yesterday um, on the global financial system helps a lot for this topic. We had a slide for Expo Week, but I didn't add to it partially because we're having a bit of an issue with Convo. So you can't right now RSVP, but we will let you know in the next, let's say, 6 to 7 hours on Convo and having it back up. The dates still hold, and we would love you to sign up if you're interested. So many of you have adventures that we think are at the point where, you know, even if it's still an idea, still something you're kind of toying with, you could share a part of it for 4 minutes, and you could get feedback on it from interested others. Some of those people will be people from past blocks. Some of those people will be mentors and others from around Kernel's orbit. Lots of people really from the crypto world and peer mentors from all over. Um, our intention is for it to be science fair style, in the gather, homey, not kind of like a public showcase of any kind, more a place to share in progress work, to get feedback on in progress live designs, and to just explore the ideas that come up together. So more to come. You've already probably seen it in the Office Hours channel, and we want you to sign up soon. We'll keep you posted on when the link is back up. Um, where we stand this week is in the third of these lines. So we started with the bedrock of all transactions is trust and playing with patterns, complementary opposites. Last week, we talked a lot about value and meaning and the ways that those words uh, intertwine in. And this week, we are talking about uh, the ways that money and speech are similar and how we might ask questions to better understand them. So first is this list of better question reminders from Kevin Kelly, who um, had a piece called 64 Pieces of Unsolicited Advice. And I really like the comic on the top right. But the fact that the most simple and seemingly silly questions are always the most profound, that good questions must come from a sincere desire to learn. Experts rarely ask good questions, be a beginner always. Own up to what you don't know, it will set you free. And close listening and close attention are preconditions for good questions. Um, and I hope that we might use that as a starting point for today. We are really here in Kernel mostly to ask better questions and to explore what we can craft out of those questions. And so we hope today will be another instance of great dialogue, and that as we get to things like Expo, um, we use that also as a time to continue crafting with questions in mind. The reason it's tied with this module, though, is because money tends to be a very like polarizing and sometimes scary topic because of how much of it requires questions upon questions upon questions upon questions, because of how often the context of money has changed over thousands of years. And this module, therefore, really requires it because there are just so many questions to ask to get to or approach the bottom of the rabbit hole. Is one approach to, let's say, explicitly talking about this and trying to, um, let's say, put a stake in the ground, which is to say that money and speech are incredibly intertwined. That is the approach that Andy took with this module. And so he says in that a tamperless or tamper-proof, borderless, ownerless global record is not just money and not just language. It's a new way of simultaneously ordering both. So if you have this ledger that you can write into, that is the type of thing that it gives you access to that was not previously possible, this closer intertwining of money and speech. In that module, you also see ideas about open money, which is a concept that predates blockchains and has been around on the internet for quite some time. Some principles that are listed here are in the module. You see where conventional money is scarce and expensive, open money is sufficient and free. Where conventional money is created by central banks, open money is issued by us as promises to redeem. Our money is our word. Where conventional money flows in and out of communities, creating dependencies harmful, the new complementary money recirculates, enabling business and trade. And it's just worth noting that these types of local currency experiments are not new and ultimately are a return to some types of roots. And that's what the module tries to illustrate. So if you go into the more curated readings, you start with Nick Szabo, the shelling out article that shows those shells that were some of the more early instantiations of money. And it's written that the precursors of money enabled early modern humans to solve problems of cooperation that other animals cannot, including problems of reciprocal altruism, kin altruism, and the mitigation of aggression. So these are some of the things when we think of it as a more, social animal perspective that were, let's say, afforded to us by the creation of money, reciprocal altruism, kin altruism, and the mitigation of aggression. And Sabo, talks about it mostly as money. Graeber, as an anthropologist, is thinking about it more from a human lens and takes the approach of writing about the first 5,000 years of debt, and debt being this controversial or like multifaceted word and how it raises feelings in people. People feel some type of way when they hear the word debt, and
Ciao, oh,
often
guardado?
often the feeling is one of guilt, and there's the association in many language between debt, guilt, and sin. But what Graeber asks us to reimagine is that debt is also a word that can be used in a more positive light. It's an opportunity for interaction. And the quote at the bottom says, if we're concerned with the level of human exchange, then we only have relationship with the other when exchange is incomplete, i.e. when there is debt. And Graeber, I've been struggling personally with the word community for a while because I think community has been overused in a lot of online contexts. But Graeber has, I think, my favorite definition of community, which is a place where everyone feels a little bit indebted to one another. That being the sign of a good ecosystem, that being a big part of a good community. So you have Graeber and Szabo. We also have Perry Merling, who does one of the best really courses on the internet about the modern money pyramid. So, okay, those were like old ideas from Graeber and Szabo. Where are we now? What is this like relationship between credit, deposits, currency, and the Federal Reserve and the Federal Reserve's ability to print money? How does that function in booms and busts? And then there's this awesome image that Holly Grimm shared that kind of shows really how modern money and modern monetary theory works in one GIF or GIF. Tell me in the chat what you think. But it is it is a really important thing that really brings up a lot of questions. But if you've never studied finance, is kind of one of the first places to go, in my opinion. And then I'll end with one uh, of my favorite things, which came up in yesterday's uh, like precursor to this conversation, which was the definition of the word economy in its roots, which were household management from oikos, house, abode, or dwelling, oikonomos, referring to managers or stewards of the household. And with that, I want to offer, as always, could have done this earlier, the option for the Figma. If you would like to take notes as things are going, it gives us an artifact to return to as a group. So you're doing a public good if you are adding to this as we go. And happily introduce Rebecca for a quick 5 minutes before doing a proper introduction of her. And it might be a bit more than 5, but Rebecca will start with 5 minutes in DeFi, but also a meandering into some of the ideas that she's been thinking about. She's done this now since Kernel block 2. So 6 blocks in a row, and really grateful to have her back.
Thanks, Vivek. It's really, really good to be here. I do just want to give a heads up that if anyone is getting some weird background from my sound system, please just let me know in the chat, because there's an alarm in my neighborhood that is going off with the wind here in Cape Town. But if you can all hear me, it's really, really good to be here. And I guess I wanted to give just a little bit of background context to this. So for the past couple of years, I have done the global financial system with Kernel. And I really, really appreciate, I just want to give a credit where credit's due to Vivek for bringing in a little bit of a twist on this, which is the local financial system, because in reality, I have to say that's actually what I feel like I have so much more experience in. So a little bit about me. Mine is really a story of emerging worlds. I grew up in a very small town in South Africa. I grew up in a town called Mthatha, which used to be the capital of an apartheid homeland. It was this weird urban, peri-urban space where it kind of became rural and you weren't really sure how that happened. I also grew up in a biracial household. I went to a crazy university where I got to travel the world. And my first job ever was at a Japanese cryptocurrency exchange. So I give you all this because I feel like this experience and this life experience informs a lot about how I think about what it means to be a technologist, what it means to grapple with new forms of technology. And I think increasingly, more so than ever, also to grapple with just the meaning of the words that we use, right? And so obviously in this context, we're talking about decentralized finance. And I know that in my own experience of having worked in decentralized finance, I often found myself asking, but like, how does it actually work? Like, if I want to use this in my own context, in my own family, what does that concretely look like? And that has informed a lot of the work that I've done. And I think without further ado, Vivek, I'm going to ask if you can actually just share the slides again, because I see that they have disappeared. There we go. So the question we're asking today is, what does the future of local money look like? I am going to give just a little bit of how I conceive of decentralized finance. So I know that some folks here have experience in Web3, others don't. But maybe we'll start with what the promise of DeFi is. And Vivek, you can go to the next slide there. So the way that I would describe DeFi is that it is finance reimagined in permissionless, programmable, and composable form. Now, what does that mean? So permissionless is that ideally there are no gatekeepers restricting who can create and participate in DeFi services. So whether that is having access to things like stablecoins or being able to send money across the world and across borders. I know that in my own experience, the first times that I ever used DeFi and what felt like a personal use case was sending money to my friend in Nigeria, because she expressly told me, if you don't send it in Bitcoin or Ethereum, it's practically worthless to me. And I'd imagine that a lot of people here have similar experiences. The second part of that definition of being programmable is what happens when you have a universal settlement layer? So if we think of something like the Ethereum virtual machine, what does that mean? It means that anyone that's using this doesn't necessarily need the same third parties that we would need in a centralized or traditional financial system. So third parties could be the legal system, it could be accountants, it could be brokers. Now we have a financial system where if I want to see that a transaction is cleared, I can go into a block explorer and that information is completely public to me. It also means that anyone can also write to the system, right? So you can go and learn smart contracts yourself. You could learn how to do Solidity coding, and you could create your own money if you wanted to. It doesn't mean that it has a value, but it at least means that you can participate in that. And then the third aspect, which I actually think is the most interesting, is this word composable. And I like this little image over here, which I took from Zerion back in the day when I was leading the growth team there, is thinking of money as Lego and thinking about what happens when we can start to stick things together that previously were not possible. And I think this is going to be a really big theme in this discussion, because we've talked about the sort of linguistic meaning and linguistic form of money changing, where money is no longer just a medium of exchange or a unit of account or a form of saving. It now also becomes potentially an access token. It now potentially becomes something that you vote with as well. And so I really like this metaphor of Lego, because a lot of the applications that we see coming out of decentralized finance, I think you'll begin to notice, sometimes feel like they have very little to do with finance to begin with. Vivek, you can go to the next slide here. I hope you all can see this. If you get rid of that comment over there, this is just a screenshot of, I think this is from Vitalik's recent blog. And I think it gives a really great summary of what the traditional financial stack might look like and what is the sort of analogy to that in DeFi. So if you think of like having a traditional banking system, now we start to think about things like Ethereum or having stable coins, instead of having things like receipts and invoices. Like maybe it's a transaction or a piece of information that's stored on a blockchain that everyone now has access to, and so on and so forth. But the point here that I really want to underscore is that because DeFi disrupts the supply and distribution of money, it in turn means that it essentially disrupts a whole lot of other things, right? It's not just financial markets. It's also things like organizational structures. It's things like tokenized governance that we typically see in decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs. It gets into questions of, well, how do people create and raise money in the first place? And then also interesting things around like what it is that we deem valuable and how we represent that in the form of things like NFTs or the creator economy. Now, these are what DeFi is aspirationally. And I say that with a lot of emphasis because I think, like many people here, I've had the experience of saying, okay, we've had these experiments in this quote unquote cloud. What does DeFi actually look like on the ground? And I think there's kind of three things that I want to highlight here, which is in my own experience of working in Web3, I would often grapple with what felt like a very intentional design around geographical irrelevance, right? So when we talk about new forms of money, it tends not to be as situated. Versus, I think what happens more in reality around designing for needs, which is that these things are situated, right? So accessing DeFi in a place like Nigeria is going to be very, very different from your experience in a place like Oakland, California. The second thing is a comment that a friend of mine actually made recently. He is a Web3 designer, and he talked about the need to create new metaphors for how people interact with this technology. And I think that's precisely what we've talked about here, of like, what is money when we're talking about it in the context of voting in a DAO, for example. So with these two things, I also want to go to the next slide here. I think it's really interesting to just note that a lot of the technology that we have right now, at least in theory, are things that have been predicted far beyond our time. This is Friedrich Hayek, who in 1976 wrote this book, The Denationalization of Money. Was extremely controversial, but at the time, in around 1984, you had him saying, well, I don't believe we'll ever have good money again before we take it out of the hands of government. We can't take it violently. All we can do is by some sly, roundabout way, introduce something that they can't stop. And in many ways, I think we've seen that play out, whether it be people's access to money when their local economy or their national economy rather no longer serves them. Or it could be the fact that, like, for the first time ever, certain people have the ability to save in currencies that they weren't actually able to. But taking from this very zoomed out view of what a world of private competing currencies can look like, I want to switch things up and talk about some of the experiences that I've had working in what I call localized finance, or at least how do we see DeFi surfacing in unlikely places? How are these instruments actually being used? And I like this term, new instruments, old practices, because I always have to emphasize, like, none of this stuff is new. We have new forms of representation. We have new technology. But if you look at the underlying instruments, when we're talking about what does it mean to actually have a digital form of credit, for example, how does that change what we deem possible at a hyper-local level? So a lot of my experiences, I think I started this with talking about working at a Japanese cryptocurrency exchange. That was around the same time that you had the ICO boom. And I remember thinking to myself, everyone's talking about banking the unbanked and democratizing finance. And none of this actually makes sense to me. This was around the same time that I found out about an organization called Grassroots Economics. And I'm going to do my best to sort of truncate 10 years of iterating on local currencies in these 4 pictures over here. So I don't know if you can see this very well from your side, but on the left, well, this was a picture taken in Jackson, Mississippi, where we will typically do what is called asset mapping in a community, right? So presumably, if you're going to have some form of local currency that's new, you want to have an understanding of what that economy actually represents. And what we would do there is pass a ball of yarn across a room and talk about kind of like a needs and offers market. So maybe I'm a car mechanic, I can offer my mechanic services, and someone else is a school teacher and they need their mechanic services. And you can imagine that ball of yarn going round and round the room. What you end up with is a network that represents what is potentially a marketplace in that community, and typically is a marketplace that isn't valued in the traditional economy. So you'll see things like childcare, spending time with elders, and so on and so forth. The second picture would be the next step in the process of practicing grassroots economics. I don't know if you can see it from where you are, but those are actually Dungeons and Dragons characters. So this is like a little co-op game that we will play, which is to say, okay, if we have all the things that we're offering in the community, what would it be like to come together and govern ourselves around that, right? So we're not just talking about creating new forms of money, we're also looking at the very structure of how people interact economically in the community. The third picture over there, I think this was taken in Kilifi in Kenya, would be the process of actually wording those commitments to each other, right? So we've talked about what we have, we've talked about how we might govern around those. What does it then look like to take those legal agreements and put them in a smart contract that is on a blockchain? And the last picture I put really as an analogy, I think this was taken also somewhere in the South in the US. Many of you might have seen this if you walk into like a Walmart these days. There's this giant wall of vouchers. You've got Starbucks, you've got Netflix. These are essentially just production loans of businesses. And the question that we always ask in communities is, why can't you just do this yourself? Why would we accept that a Starbucks does this? Okay, maybe because they're a legal entity and they're a real business, right? So what if we do that business development at a hyperlocal level? What would it look like to have that same wall of vouchers, i.e. production loans, but in the community that we're in right now? And if you go to the next slide there, Vivek, what you see on the right is the Sarafu network right now. So this is operational in Kenya, parts of South Africa, Uganda, and Cameroon. These are all communities that have essentially gone through this process, right? So what you're seeing there between nodes is any kind of economic interaction that's happened. So they're trading on a blockchain. These different currencies that come from the different communities are currently based on Celo. They've gone through many iterations. They started with Ethereum, they were on Gnosis, Gnosis became XDAI, they're now on Celo, but the point is that these are communities trading with each other using their own form of exchange. And that graph that you're seeing there is about 70,000 plus households. And again, this is all happening on a blockchain and has been happening since 2018. So when we talk about decentralized finance, enabling people to sort of create their own money Legos, it's also things like this. And I find these examples really, really fascinating because they're not just about the money. There's a whole governance process that happens here as well. And in the definition there, you know, Sarafu Network is a decentralized application that enables people to publish, register, and exchange their commitments to deliver products as digital vouchers. Emphasis on the commitments. This is a very different way of thinking about what it means to create a currency. So whereas typically we might say, we're going to create a certain token that people can gather around, and we're just going to rely on trust and maybe marketing for people to accept this. What grassroots economics does kind of subverts that process and starts with, what do we already have? What can we already offer each other? And this is based on a credit theory of money, which is that money isn't just this ambiguous commodity that we will buy into. Maybe, and this is also getting to Graeber's work, money starts with obligations to each other, right? And this is also getting into perhaps a healthier definition of what obligation and debt actually means. What can you do when you have ties of reciprocity to each other? And what happens when you can start to study, for example, the velocity of money in a community? Perhaps not all dollars are the same, because if $1 is circulating in a community 10 times versus one that circulates in a community 1 time, arguably the other one is worth a little bit more in terms of economic value and output. So if you go to the next slide there, Vivek, this was just a study that I did, kind of showing more the development side of this. So in a lot of refugee camps across Africa, organizations like the Red Cross and the GIZ are now looking at things like community currencies based on blockchains as a form of cash transfer, because they do have this other sort of government development component within the communities. But it's not just about economic development. So Vivek, if you go to the next slide over here, I'm in Cape Town right now, and I actually was really, really excited to go and visit these guys. They're out in a community called Ocean View in South Africa. So they've been doing mesh networking for a really long time, which is essentially expanding Wi-Fi access in communities. They're now working with grassroots economics and tying that to a community currency system. And I think this is super fascinating once you start to get into decentralized physical infrastructure, where you start to tie in whether it's access to energy or water systems. What happens when we're able to tokenize those? And does that change the way that we govern physical assets in communities? And if you go to the next slide, Vivek, I just wanted to highlight, this was some of the other work that we did in Oakland, California, where we did the first sort of localized quadratic funding round. So stress testing a lot of the governance mechanisms tools that we've seen in Web3 and crypto, and asking, well, if you had a local treasury, if you had a community currency, what would it mean to then also vote on that? And so I offer all of these examples just to show that a lot of what decentralized finance is capable of, in my opinion, is most interesting when applied at the hyperlocal level. I think it's really about what do the new sort of socio-digital tools look like in urban settings? And of course, these are just 3 examples of many. I mean, I think that this conversation could also go in the direction of things like, what does it look like to, for example, put carbon credits so that communities can earn from these systems? But the point is, the tools are available. A lot of the value that we've talked about, and I think also a lot of the critique of DeFi of not sort of reaching the last mile, I think often ignores these kinds of examples. And so I'm really excited to dive into a Q&A. I'm curious to hear, like, if there are also other examples of where you guys come from of seeing DeFi used in these ways. But yeah, that's like my experience with grassroots economics. I think the arc of the story is very much like DeFi in the clouds, and then like DeFi in the community that I actually live in, which has been a really incredible journey.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And you guys already have better context than I can really provide, but I just want to add a few things on context there while we get into question mode. There's already quite a few in the chat that I'll help catch you up on, Rebecca. But I welcome any other questions as we get into that part of the call. It'll be mostly just back and forth Q&A. The one other piece of context I do want to provide is that Rebecca has been training to become an architect as of most recently, and it's really inspiring to see, because for somebody who didn't have this exact context, these stories, it might seem kind of confusing why she would want to do that. But it starts to make a lot of sense if you put it in the context that she says, because her point at the beginning was that DeFi tends not to be as situated in local space. And if you want to situate local space well, then the first thing that you are looking at is how is the local space architected? How does that space look? And how does it feel? And I really love the images of the webs. I want to imagine those further and kind of hear more stories of what happened on that day with that web and what happened on this day with this web. But I mostly want to hear from other voices. So I wonder, I mean, Marquita, you were one that we thought we could start with potentially with the word that you shared in Bolivian traditional economics. So if you're willing, we could start there.
Yeah, sure.
Please.
Sorry that my video's off. My internet connection has been a little bit it hasn't been cooperating. So yeah, just I'll keep the video off. But that was super interesting, Rebecca. Like, thank you so much for everything that you shared. So yeah, like I'm connecting in from La Paz in Bolivia. And while I was listening to you, I mean, just two things really stood out. For one, like just how important it is to sort of take these concepts that very easily can sort of feel like universal in some way and just kind of recognize that they always come from a specific geography and a specific time, and with a specific kind of politics behind it very often, right? So yeah, just sort of, I loved everything that you shared there about kind of taking it back to the local. And it reminded me when you were sharing the example of people sort of mapping out their asset mapping, you were saying. So there's this concept in Bolivian traditional economics called trueque, and it's basically that idea. Have you heard of that? I saw you nod your head. Yeah, cool. Yeah, so basically with trueque, like it can work in terms of people sort of sharing goods that they have. Like what's interesting about Bolivia is that it has sort of various climates and kind of ecological pisos, like ecological floors. I don't know how to translate that quite. So like traditionally people have sort of exchanged different fruits and vegetables across these different kind of climates. But also it extends to labor, right, and work and kind of collective decision-making processes under this concept of Aini, which is reciprocity. So it all just ties in really nicely with everything that you just shared. And yeah, like it's something that has like thousands of years of history behind it. But for example, in the pandemic, right, when everything got shut down, lots of communities turned to trueque again, and it was a way of sort of kind of cultivating oh, excuse me, sorry, I get a bit shy when I prefer to type because I get a bit shy like speaking, but yeah, it kind of kept people connected, and it meant that they were able to kind of get what they needed in that really difficult moment.
Yeah, it's always you know, I was trained as an economist, and I studied computational science, and as Vivek said, I'm now interested in architecture, so I'm interested in a lot of things. But I will say that coming from an economics background, it's always interesting sort of trying to explain why these networks do at the scale that they do. And I want to, you know, be really clear here that we are talking about a very specific scale, right? Like it's one thing to go into a fishing village in Kenya. It's something very different to go into a community in Mississippi. The contexts are completely different. And the role of social infrastructure cannot be emphasized enough. Vivek, you talked about, you know, maybe just giving a little bit more color to some of these examples here. The network that I shared in the other slide of, you know, 70,000 households trading. And I mean, people are literally buying their groceries and paying for transport. And in some of these communities, you can pay for your church tithes and your school fees and things like that. And, you know, you have this money circulating in the community, and there's been lots of studies that have been done on this. But I remember going into the community of Jackson, Mississippi, and when we first started playing that game of what can you offer each other, it was very apparent that the context was extremely different in terms of trust. There are some places where if you do not have a university education, you believe that you have nothing to offer your community. And that's just fundamentally not true, right? There's a very strong emphasis on what is it that we can give, right? If the basic unit of a community is reciprocity, you have to first believe that you have something to offer for an exchange to occur. And I think what is really sad with the sort of current form of our financial system, especially in marginalized communities, is you take away that medium of exchange and you take away people's sense of dignity. And so, yes, it's really cool that this is all on a blockchain. I think that there are serious advantages in terms of efficiency and being able to track things. But a lot of where the magic happens actually is getting a bunch of folks together in a room and saying, what can we offer each other? And then working through the rest of the design process together as a community.
Yeah, that's huge. That's huge. I saw JP with the hand raised. There's now 3 or 4 questions in the chat. Always love hearing other people's voices, but JP, if you'd like, and then anyone in the chat, feel free to raise your hand as well.
Yeah, it happens to me when I go to my local farmers market or like the artisans market, that I have a very meaningful exchange with the person that is selling something that that person created. And when the moment of exchanging money happens, like I feel a little bit weird in that moment, you know, and I always think, what if that moment was hid behind the interaction? You know, how could that moment be invisible so that we could remain with the connection with that other human, not not interfaced through that economical exchange. Like I am getting something that is more meaningful than that economical exchange. And that's why I want to pay. But I wonder, and here comes my question, if you have seen an experiment or like a place where that economical exchange has been abstracted so that the people can remain in that heart-to-heart connection, you know?
So I'm going to rephrase your question just to make sure that I understand it. Is the question, when this interaction is abstracted, perhaps into digital format, are there examples of where we've somehow managed to keep that sense of like knowing what the transaction means and knowing who's on the other side of the transaction? Is that what you're asking?
Like I was asking more of examples of an event or a situation on which, for example, the price of a certain good was agreed before the moment on which I interact with that person. So, for example, she has 5 books on sale and I already know how much they are worth. So I don't ask that person how much they are and I pay for them later, you know, and there is like this trust layer in the community.
I see. Okay. Right, the first thing that comes to mind, and I'm not sure how well this is going to answer your question, but it seems like it's parallel with what grassroots economics does, is when they talk about their commitment vouchers, typically what they might do is, let's say you have someone that, you know, wants to invest in a local community because they have philanthropic means or whatever. When you set those commitment vouchers, you say, okay, my carrots in this example are worth X amount. By buying those, you are entering into an agreement with me, my vouchers. You're essentially giving me a production loan. And when I now exchange this voucher for someone else's voucher, that value has already been set. So there is sort of this price setting in that sense. And then you can start to have exchange between people. And maybe those prices need to change based on exchange rates because you now have multiple community vouchers interacting with people. But the point here is that you don't just have like an abstract form of money that is kind of moving between people. The vouchers actually do mean something, right? They are tied to a physical asset that someone has sat down and defined as having a particular value. And now it's up for the community to come together and say, well, you know, if we don't think that you're making good on your promise, there need to be certain accountability measures around that. So this isn't quite abstracting at just the point of sale, but my point is that behind the money and the movement of that money in the community, there are a cascade of processes that get to the point where we trust that this thing is actually worth X amount and is, you know, good for what we are exchanging it for.
That's awesome. That answers a few questions in the chat as well. But maybe we go to Maya next.
Hi, Rebecca. Hi, Vivek.
Hello.
So I think I accidentally muted myself. Not so much of a question, but more of a point, especially about African crypto. There's been loads of different cases of this abstraction, and what we're starting to see is that crypto is a means, not an end in itself, right? So when we're thinking of crypto, typically we treat it as though like people should buy into the notion of crypto, but that's not how you achieve mass adoption. And so grassroots, like, you know, these are great examples, but there's even examples a bit further along than those. And what I mean by further along, it's not just the last mile, there's a middle mile. So for example, in Nigeria, every OTC desk secretly in the background has used crypto. Not recently, but they've done it for a while, even though there's a separation of TradFi from DeFi in Nigeria until this month, right? For the last 3 years, yeah. There's companies such as Gia and Nuzo, right? These companies they're more Kenya based and East Africa based, but what they're doing is Gia is looking at how you can provide lending using crypto liquidity as liquidity pools, but at an affordable rate, and you're offering it up to mum and pop shops, right? At better rates than they would conventionally get. And so the point I guess I'm making is that crypto in Africa is really booming. And I think sometimes there's a narrative of thinking of it like especially more in terms of helping to alleviate poverty. But it's more than that. Like, it's being used in really subtle ways that people don't even realize they're engaging with crypto, one. And two, it's being used by like tons of people who are employed on the continent as a way to store their wealth and protect their wealth against devaluation. So I guess, yeah, that was very rambly. Sorry, I'm not the best structured. But yeah.
Thanks, Maya. I feel like just the last aspect of that also touched on, there were some questions in the chat way up. I think a couple of people asking, you know, sort of what are the challenges that you come into, you know, when you're onboarding people, and what you just said about crypto being the means and not the end. I think from with the designer's hat on, is so important to remember. Like, I think I forgot to put the picture in here, but like, these are all USSD codes. At no point is anyone you know, logging into their wallet to save their private keys. And they've had some really sophisticated ideas around how they have non-custodial systems. But the point is, what you want here is a stable medium of exchange that people have agreed to within a specific community. And I do remember going into a place like Oakland where we were trying to incubate a local currency there, and I believe they are actually operating in farmers markets. That conversation was completely different, because you now were in a community where there was a very, very high demographic of technologists that were really, really interested in like, well, what's the wallet onboarding experience? And I think it's really important at the end of the day to also just ask, like, what is the problem that you're solving, and can you do the thing? And I do believe in also gradated user experiences. So like, maybe you don't need to have the non-custodial wallet if you can at least make sure that like the settlement layer on having a workable medium of exchange in a community works to begin with. And I do think that that's a trend that you would see amongst African use cases of crypto, whether that be remittances, whether that be how OTC desks runs, or even hyperlocal examples like this one. I think the reason that they've been able to have the adoption that they have is that they just sort of do the thing that they're supposed to do, and often using very, very simple sort of low infrastructure technology that just happens to work really well.
Okay, well, there's so many questions in the chat that I would love, if anyone is willing to raise their hand, we can have them ask them. I could try to do rapid fire through some of them, but let me see what the best way is to do this. I want to go to some so we don't lose them, and maybe Rebecca will do rapid fire through some of them. Okay. So a couple questions on just like, how do you train people in communities to use decentralized tech stack, MetaMask? What was the crypto onboarding process like when you bridged these communities?
Yeah, so again, in Kenya, a lot of the system there is just USSD, which is honestly no different from using something like M-Pesa. So you have like a USSD front end, which is kind of like those feature phone menus. You press 1 to send, and you type in the number of the person, and then it settles. And of course, there is a database that is then actually connected to the Stellar blockchain. When I did actually confront having to work with folks on MetaMask, I will say very openly, it was one of the most cringe experiences of my life, trying to run a quadratic funding program in Oakland, and people bringing in their grandma to vote on the local nonprofit, and then having to walk them through setting up a MetaMask and going through Gitcoin. And this was before they had their fancy makeover. It was absolutely brutal. Like it was prototypical. It was brutal. I would never ever want to do that again. And honestly, just cemented my, I think, like very strong opinions on like, what is the priority here? What are you trying to do? Does it need to be the non-custodial high-tech thing at the get-go for every single user? Or like, maybe is that something that you work up towards, but you actually focus on the problem that you're trying to solve?
Okay. And so then maybe this next question, which is about what are the most common challenges you've seen while these local economies have started to run, and what are the responses? If maybe you focus not on the like UX things, although that may be big, but like the local economies starting to run.
Without being too reductionist, just honestly trust. Like trust, straight up human relations. You go into, firstly, you don't go into a community and be like, hey, let's create a local currency. Usually the community, at least in grassroots economics' case, will come to them and say, this is something that we've been exploring for a really long time. So for example, when we were kind of in the South, we were, among Atlanta, Mississippi, New Orleans, a lot of the communities in that case are cooperatives. They've been around for a really, really, really long time and have thought about like, how do we develop different aspects of our economy, and what is the medium that sort of sticks those two together? Can we start to experiment with this new technology? Now they, yes, are sort of the node that you're going to be working with, but they also represent a whole bunch of trust relationships. I've been in, community workshop series in the South where like people walk in with like guns on their hips and are not at all open to this in any way. And so it's like just the level of trust that you have and building and moving at the speed of trust, I think is the most important thing, but also where the majority of the challenges lie. It's like, well, do you trust a person? It doesn't matter how good they say their technology is. Why would I trust you to come in with something new? And oftentimes that can take like literally years of relationship building to get to a point where you're actually deploying something like this.
Okay. Lots of hands raised for Rebecca, but I want to give her a break and try to get to like a thread. If Dave and John are willing, I thought that was a really poignant question, and maybe one that it seemed like John may have had a response to, and we can kind of just like have it meander that way. Rebecca, you can catch up on chat a bit and pop back in when you want.
Sure. Happy to jump in very quickly. There's so many threads. Firstly, thanks so much, Rebecca, for the sharing. I think I'm so happy and lucky that of all the Kernel fire chats around DeFi that you've been a part of, we got the local one, because I feel like this seems like really important, because yeah, this is where I think the spirit or of why we're all here and where sort of crypto came from. Yeah, I think there are many threads that I think we could take it in. Like here so I'm based in Thailand, and there's a big sort of Myanmar diaspora here, partly because of the civil war and the coup that took place 3 years ago. Actually, today is the third anniversary. And it's been really fascinating to see how crypto adoption has been taking place there. And, you just talked about trust. And it's been very interesting to see how there's been so much pushback from what I've been hearing from friends from Myanmar, where because of how crypto has been associated with scams, so a lot of like online scamming, phone scamming, which is huge. And so most people's association with crypto tends to be, oh, that's a scam thing. And the challenge that people have had with sort of getting adoption. And then another one that I've often heard is that, again, as you mentioned, the custodial problem, right? MetaMask is difficult, especially to like in an environment where you barely have internet. Yet at the same time, like stable coins as a use case for adoption has been really, really strong because of the sort of threat of inflation and like the need to move money in and out of the country that's not in control of the military. So yeah, I feel like it's interesting to see how these use cases are developing. And I'm trying to get to a question, but I think there's many questions, but I think maybe the one that I put in the chat, which is something that maybe is something that I think about that a lot as far as like systems and what are we doing differently and how do we think back to, yeah, like, you know, ancient practices or wisdoms or ideas that worked and we've kind of forgotten. And one of the points that David Graeber brought up in his talk around debt was about how for most of our time we've actually we've protected debtors, but now it's kind of flipped in today where we're protecting creditors and not debtors. And I wonder if like or anyone can share examples of how what these protocols are being designed in this way, or communities are using protocols in ways where we're going back to these practices rather than like replicating the same system of that sort of Graeber mentions when it comes to debt. Yeah, hope that question sort of makes sense in the spirit of asking questions.
Definitely. And I don't know, John, if it's right to call on you, but was your comment on capital controls related to Dave's question?
It was related to, and I'm sorry, I forget who was talking about just how crypto is booming in Africa, but it was in response to that. And just, you know, essentially, I had this really incredible conversation with a colleague this year from Nigeria, and I was completely ignorant to the fact that you know, many people who live in countries where there's you know, hyperinflation or you know some national currency that is experiencing hyperinflation, that they impose capital controls. The government will impose capital controls on their citizens. So this Nigerian colleague was just sharing that it's very difficult to access dollars to travel abroad or to, you know, coordinate with people, send remittances, or, you know, start a business or something like that. And that's why, in his opinion, stable coins are so popular in Africa. So there's this like secondary market where you can work around those capital controls. And in many cases, like Nigerians will travel abroad, open an OTC desk in, you know, another country, just to service the demand that's coming from Nigeria for stable coins. I mean, totally incredible. And it makes me feel so ignorant to the rest of the world. And just, yeah, a nice example of like the very real use case of stable coins.
Yeah. I see Abidemi's reaction, and I'm compelled to check with Abidemi and maybe Sister Tobeba, given they're in Africa and specifically Kenya and Nigeria. Abidemi, please.
Yeah. I guess like the last conversation just reminded me of the conversation that we had about you know, during when I was trying to organize the Kernel Convo, and you know, even the differences in exchange rates and how it was so wide apart. Yeah, so I guess this just made me laugh a bit, and also because I'm in Nigeria, so I'm kind of like living the reality. But I think that's aside from what I want to share. So like what I enjoy the fact that like we're talking about the various use cases of crypto and how, to be honest, I would say like emerging economies are sort of like the best use case for this technology, because like we desperately need it. Other regions can't do without it or can't live without it, but like this is basically what is saving us. I think another way that we could think about this, or we could think about it in a more less, how can we move forward, or how can we make sure that like in the next 100 years, we're not still speaking about currency devaluation in Africa or even in emerging economies. It's like, so it's like even reading the sections on, debt, on speaking, on languages, money. I love Gerber's videos. I love this video, and I love actually taking a look at how he talked about debt, because I really think that has contributed also to a lot of the problems that emerging economies experience because they've actually raked in debts that they can't sustain. And those debt they function in different ways, and they can actually be translated into different, I would say, like into different sections in terms of like debt as a means of control, as like controlling poor people, debt as a means of actually as a means of community, of like saying, oh yeah, I give you a cup of sugar today, tomorrow you owe me a cup of salt, and stuff like that. But generally, there is a paper that I really enjoyed, I go back to whenever people talk about, especially the problem in Nigeria, because like it just really nails our problem really succinctly, and like it's a section in Fractali's white paper. So like Fractali, I think like it's a project within Decent DAO, and I liked that section because like the section talked about how in countries or like in nations where people do not believe in or do not respect the laws, or like the laws are actually not kept, you consistently find currency devaluation, because like that means that people cannot trust the system. And even though sometimes like we think of these things as just like separate things, as like, oh, this is money and then this is your court of law, like whatever happens in your court of law, or like however corrupt your nation is, will translate to how your currency is, because like people do not believe anymore in what you can say. So somehow it will just really trickle down and affect how people actually trade with your currency, because currency is more than what we can see physically. And every time like we have conversations around money, it just takes me back to that conversation. But like the question we need to be asking is how we can use like all of these technologies to actually build better systems of trust, and also of value, because I think that is what everything just like translates at the end of the day. If our society doesn't have trust, it doesn't matter what kind of currency we design or we create from this currency. It doesn't matter if we build new currencies, if we cannot build strong systems of trust that can actually stand the test of time and that can go on themselves without anybody actually going back to like supervise them, we will continue to be in a mess. So yeah, I guess that's just what I wanted to contribute.
Thank you. Thank you, Abidemi. Amazing. Rebecca, do you have anything in general that's coming up for you, given what you've been seeing?
Yeah, what you just said about like, how do you use these systems to build trust? I think that this is where the coordination layer has to come in. And that's where I'm actually really optimistic, quite frankly, about a lot of the sort of use cases that people are starting to look into with crypto. Decentralized technology being used to either crowd fund or manage things like physical infrastructure and shared assets. I think that if we're asking the question of how do we start to embed this into like the operating systems of how we coordinate and how we collaborate, like even if some of those use cases still seem very fringe or very small, like that's actually where I'd be looking, because that to me kind of contains the seed of, for example, is having every sort of transaction and interaction within a network being public always a good thing within a community, whether that's a community that's managing a Wi-Fi grid, or a community that's making decisions about how to spend certain amounts of money. And I say I'm optimistic because I think there are several projects around that are actually doing this as we speak. But I think that you're quite right in pointing out that the sort of digital tool alone around money doesn't really change things in terms of the dynamics of human behavior. But what's interesting about, something like this around reciprocity, and someone asked it in the chat of like, well, what do you do if someone doesn't honor their commitment? Well, presumably there are a set of rules that you put into place in terms of how you manage that, right? So at the scale of the community, it could be maybe you have a fine, or maybe you have to go back to the drawing board and ask yourselves, well, how many of these vouchers do we allow people to mint themselves? And so again, that process of coming together and governing underlying this economic system is what holds it up. It's not that the economic system alone, it just ensures that suddenly people are working together. The human part, the messy part of coordinating and deciding what we're okay with and what we're not okay with, that's what builds that trust. And I just hope that with more of the crypto projects we see, that element will be emphasized as well.
Mm-hmm. obligations, needs, offers. These are great. Incredible. Yeah. Sister Tibebwa, please. You're still muted.
Yes, greetings of love and light and peace and darkness. Can everyone hear me?
We can, sister. Hello.
Oh, give thanks and praise. Hello, so good to be home. Loving the reasoning on grassroots economics. Rebecca, thank you so much for all the work that you put in. Worked for several years now with Will Ruddick and brought grassroots economics to Lamu Island several times because they have a great system where trainers train in local mother tongue, which I find is really important. Great games like hands-on games where teaching communities with a game of beans, you know, where whoever spends all his beans or her beans, if you want to say, wins the game instead of the other way around, that everyone thinks that whoever gets the most beans wins. And so I found that really helped. You know, we have a women's group called the Penda Women, and so the trainers came and had a great time playing with us all. I did find that using the USSD code, because most people are still on the block phones like the Nokia phones, so obviously having a wallet on your phone is not necessarily an easy thing, but using the USSD code is cost prohibitive. So I know that grassroots economics has to look for outside sponsorship to be able to sponsor the USSD codes. And so that's constantly reliant on an outside funder, which does take away from decentralization or sovereignty. And that's something that I have found a little tricky because we're constantly depending on, for instance, I think it's Red Cross at the moment. I have found both Rebecca and Will to be at least 20 years ahead of their time. It's totally inspirational what is being done here, especially on the coast in Kenya. I was able to take part in a training, like a local church group had asked grassroots economics to come and train them, and I've found that that's where it really works, where there's an existing community that already trust each other. So like a church community, like women's groups, like where I found it challenging here on Lamu Island is we're many communities all living together. And so it's a little more different. There's many different local languages. There's many different, there's an international community too. And so it's less applicable, as you quite rightly say, where there's no inherent trust. Like if you're a church group, you inherently trust each other. And so I just wanted to underscore that, yes, trust is most important. I do want to also share something that we've learned the hard way is that, and what I would love to put out if there's anyone who's interested in co-creating, which is how would we give an experiential, like an embodied experience of, in terms of an empowerment tool to empower a people who have never ever imagined that they have any agency in their own lives. It means working with women. If you've never been asked, what do you think? What do you believe? Like, what do you want? How do you feel about that? If those questions are foreign to your experience, then how do you get to the point of agency and believing that you have a power to shape your future? And so, and it can't be taught through talking. It can't be taught through books or through conferences or workshops. It really has to be experiential and something that's embodied. And so I'm very, very focused on that. feeling that we need more nodes, work with young people here on the island, working with a local school, Bright Girls School, which is a high school for girls, no computers whatsoever in the school for teaching. So the girls are going through high school without ever touching a computer. So, you know, we need to be empowering young people here in Africa to have a voice in our new world. That means we need coders, anyone who wants to come and volunteer, please, please, please come. We've got bringing the blockchain to Lamu. It's on Gitcoin. It's our focus this time. So yeah, loving the coming together and the synergy and the focus on Africa. Give much thanks and praise.
Thank you, sister. Thank you. Amazing. John or George? We have a bit more time.
Hey all, you friends out there. Great to hear from you, sister. Always appreciate your guidance and wisdom in these conversations and having you in the community. So great to hear your voice. Rebecca, I was wondering if you have any thoughts around sort of the intersection of digital UBIs and local currencies. I've been thinking a lot about how there is some potential for UBIs or some sort of digital UBIs, crypto-based UBIs to potentially bootstrap local economies. But obviously there's many challenges to doing that. But I'm wondering if you have thought at all about that, or if you kind of see that intersection and where there is value in bringing sort of a new currency in the form of a UBI that might become a local currency. And any thoughts around that would be amazing.
This is a whole different fireside chat. I'm going to really do my best here. I mean, from the onset, I'll actually say I'm pretty critical of UBI, and I think it helps to first ask, well, what time scale are you looking at, right? I'm never going to say it's not great to give people money that will go and do amazing things with it and reinvest it into their businesses, and that's obviously just like a structural issue of like, how do you actually get liquidity into communities? My issue with UBI, seen in the context of local currencies, and you know, this is something that I'm still grappling with. So, you know, if someone wants to have a conversation on the Kernel chat Slack after this, let's absolutely do that. My issue with UBI is simply introducing money without simultaneously doing the grassroots work of actual development and capacity building, I think is insufficient. And this is the critique of, you know, like cash transfer programs. I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, give directly and that sort of thing. It's like, it's great that you give people money, but does it structurally change economic relationships in the community? And that structural change of economic relationships is in the governance processes of like, you know, are we a business? Are we a co-op? What are our agreements with each other? I'm not saying those two are mutually exclusive. I can definitely see a world in which they coexist. I think my critique is mainly in sort of the implementation of UBI that we've seen in a lot of, you know, development projects, is it does tend to feel like airdropping money. And I think in the context of a local currency, to airdrop money and then ask people to trust that money if it's a different form, you know, if it's not national currency, is a bit of a hard sell. And again, that's why I ask, what's your time scale? If we're measuring on the scale of a month or a couple of months, like, it's probably great. If we're measuring on the scale of years and decades, I think you're probably going to have different answers to that. But really happy to chat about this further online.
I think we have time for maybe one more. George, made it.
Hi. Yeah, your talk was amazing. The grassroots economics practices are things that I would like to start implementing locally, basically immediately. And I'm really encouraged to hear that there's some of this done in Oakland. There's maybe overlapping communities here. I'm in the capital of California, Sacramento. And you know, they're at or below subsistence level. I mean, just people that have varied pasts, but right now, you know, have increasingly less or almost nothing, or barely able to make rent or buy groceries, you know, not eating right. There's kind of I don't know, like almost a kind of a pretense to maintaining a kind of dignity and a hesitation to really understand like the desperateness of each other's situations at times, and then coming to know people very closely and kind of understanding what that level is, you know, is making it clear how important it is to open that up and to get different sorts of relationships. And one of the things I did was, you know, very fledgling, I think, compared to some of what's been done, which was like create a paper bill, like a favor economy, where you give an hour of your time to somebody in the form of a paper bill, you know, that you know, can be good for any favor you might want to give them. I had one for 8 hours that I gave to somebody that was out on the street, and I wrote my number on the back of it, and he ended up calling me back. I drove him to the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicle, and, you know, elsewhere, and, you know, helped him get groceries and stuff like that because he didn't have a car to drive. And then within my friend group, like passing out these bills, like it automatically opened up these sorts of you know, process of reciprocity, like having one-on-ones with somebody we maybe didn't know too well, or, you know, helping somebody with something. And yeah, I definitely want to grow that out and do more of it. And by contrast to Oakland, I want to say, I mean, the Sustainable Economies Law Office is over there, or Law Center. In Sacramento, there's almost no like co-op consciousness. Like it's been a little bit strange. I feel like there would be something fundamentally new in this city if like we continue to do that, like, you know, within my peer group here. So I wanted to ask you what the way forward might be for what I've just described.
Yeah, well, the first thing that comes to mind is I would love to put you in contact with the folks in Oakland that are doing this, and maybe just get together. What you said about co-op consciousness, I mean, that goes a long way. That's essentially what Sister Tibebo was saying, which is like the belief that things can be different, the belief that we can coordinate differently. Like, it really helps when you work in regions and communities where that has been nurtured over decades and decades. But I do think that, like, just zooming out the whole US right now, I think that is a very, very relevant question. There was a documentary that just came out on Robert Putnam's work on people being part of social clubs. Like, that is essentially has died out in a lot of the sort of social fabric of the US. But to your question specifically, I'd love to put you in contact with them. I can just reach out to you on Slack. But like, start with conversations. That's it. Start with conversations, invite the people that are interested. And if this is something that you've already been experimenting with in these sort of low-hanging fruit ways, the good news is that, like, this technology is open source. And I would love to see communities taking this and being like, well, how do we change that and redesign it to the context that's here?
Thanks so much.
Sorry, I was muted, but amazing. I think we only have 10 minutes left. I just want to thank everyone who's been able to stick around through it. I know Fireside can be very rapid fire, and there's lots of thoughts in the chat and a lot of content to keep up with. So I would like to bring us in for a close with a question that I think Ankit posed really thoughtfully in the chat. So we've talked a lot. We've gone very deep this week on local financial system contexts and the strength and agency and resiliency that can be aimed for, but that is happening in like these small pockets ultimately. And they can feel very disparate compared to the large, broad, global financial system. And so, Rebecca, perhaps you can try to help us imagine like how you think those worlds can again come together, given where we started this conversation, which was on the hopes for decentralized finance and the ways in which the hyperlocal, hyper-specific context seeps out more globally.
Yeah, two things here. The first one is, if we look at grassroots economics and, you know, what decentralized finance enables, like this graph that you see over there, you can't really see all the colors, but each of those colors is a specific community. Some of those sort of like hubs that you see of nodes are tiny. They're just like co-ops of like 10 people, but the instrument is the same. and the instrument is interoperable. And so you can imagine a world where this maybe represents the coast of Kenya, or in fact, it probably represents the coast and parts of Nairobi, could be also connected to a network that is in a different country. So I do think there's something about just having the same standards of technology where you can have that exchange that previously wasn't possible, that I think addresses some of Ankit's question. But the second part that comes to mind, which ironically maybe contradicts what I just said, is if you go back to Friedrich Hayek's point on competing national currencies or competing currencies in general, something that I've learned through this work is it's okay to have different money for different things. I think like we tend to have this assumption that if technology works in one place, it must work in every place at all times for all people. And that's just like not how it works. You know, if you're someone that did not grow up in a country that had a stable form of currency, you're probably quite used to moving between different things. Now, of course, we want to reduce frictions and make things easier and accessible for people, but saying that a form of money works really, really well at a hyperlocal level, you do need to also have considerations for how behavior changes at different scales. And I think that this is a huge research and design question that, quite frankly, we haven't really grappled with at the scale of millions, maybe at hundreds of thousands, right? I mean, this is a network of like 70,000 plus, and it's growing. But the question of, well, can something that's a commitment voucher that works for a fishing village also work for a country? Maybe not. And so what is the sort of intermediary between those two, if there's still systems that can speak to each other? These are the kinds of design questions that we have to grapple with when we're talking about decentralized finance. Having something be a token or be an ERC20 doesn't really tell me much about the way that it works at different scales. So I don't have an answer to that, but my intuition, my inkling is that maybe we just have different forms of value for different use cases. And I think that's something we've done throughout human history and will probably continue to do.
Well said. Well said. Rebecca, thank you so much. And thank you everybody for all of the dialogue that you brought in and the questions and the thoughts. Many good questions. Hopefully we approached better ones as time went on. And I hope everyone has a really, really wonderful rest of your day. We're just going to end today with a song with the intention that it takes you well into the rest of your day. But if you want to take off early, you're welcome to. If you'd like to listen, we'll play some Ethiopian jazz, given the context. I hope everyone has a good day. We'll see you soon. Okay, everybody. Take care. Thanks, Rebecca. Thank you, everybody.